Welcome to Engaging the Supernatural, where we explore what God is saying to us today through signs, wonders, and miracles. I'm excited to have a guest on today who I've actually gotten to interview a number of times for my various podcasts. But he is one of the first authors whose books introduced me to heaven encounters, near death experiences, and really opened me up to that world. So I'm excited to have him share about his journey of exploring this space today. John, welcome to the show, man. It's great to see you.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Sean.
It is really kind of funny to interview somebody for the TV show who I've had on the podcast because I feel like we've already had this conversation. So I kind of already knew where I wanted to go. But in terms of your journey into this heaven space, the near death experience space, we have tons of friends in common who actually clinically died and had a heaven experience. But you and I always say we're honorary members of the NDE club. We talked to lots of people who had these experiences, but we haven't yet. So
No.
for you, what was your introduction? How did you get interested in the heaven encounter near death experience space?
Very accidental. From my perspective, I think God knew what he was doing. I was actually an agnostic, skeptic. I didn't know what I thought about God. I thought Jesus was probably just a good man, good teacher. But my dad was dying of cancer. And someone gave him the very first research on when people clinically die and they're resuscitated and they come back talking about an experience of the life to come. They say that it was more real than anything they've ever experienced here on earth. And that was actually what coined the term near-death experience. And I saw the booklet on my dad's dresser. And I picked it up and started just thumbing through it, and I couldn't put it down. And by the end of it, I said, oh my gosh, this God, Jesus stuff may be real. And if so, I need to find out. So that kind of opened my mind to even the possibility of the gospel. The next year, one of my buddies who he came to Christ, and he invited me into a small group. And that's where I actually understood salvation by grace and faith and came to faith. So I then, years later, I went from a career in engineering. So I studied engineering. So I'm very analytical minded. And I went from a career in engineering to becoming a pastor, starting a church for doubters and skeptics like me.
I know that's a long story. Can you give us the elevator pitch version of how you go from being an engineer to being a pastor? There had to be like a pivot moment that was critical there.
Well, I think like all of us, I had a mentor challenging me to keep ministering to people at the workplace, and I did more and more. And I was volunteering in a ministry. And I think just more and more I realized this is what God created me to do. I was so excited about what I was learning about relationship with God, and I wanted people to know that. And so I just didn't have enough time working my full-time job.
Your job was getting in the way.
My job was getting in the way. Now, honestly, it was a 2-year wrestling match.
Sure.
Because a lot of my identity was caught up in being
Right.
successful.
And when you're successful and you have a career and you leave it to go some other crazy direction, family and friends think you're nuts. Like, why would you do that?
Oh, they did. I mean, they said things like, you're abandoning what your father, my father had died. And he's like, everything he had built into you and you're abandoning it. So it was very difficult. But it was exactly what the Lord wanted me to do. And so, for the last 35 years, I have had a curiosity about these near-death experiences. And I think the Lord kept leading me into them. I actually gave my first talk on this at the University of California, Santa Barbara in 1989.
Wow.
So that's how long I've been at it. But it took me till 2015 to actually write the book, and studying over 1,000 of them over that time period. And, I wrote Imagine Heaven really to show this amazing correlation with what the Bible has taught all along about the life to come, but seeing it illustrated through the eyes of people who have actually been there when they've clinically died. What's amazing to me, no heartbeat, no brain waves.
Right.
They're brought back sometimes minutes later, sometimes hours later. Sometimes by resuscitation, sometimes just miraculously. The doctor's like, oh, I don't know. Don't want to think about it.
There's usually a moment in the morgue or someplace where it's like, the guy came back.
Yeah, literally. Sometimes that is what happens. And And so I was trying to show two things. One, to skeptics like I was trying to show this is real. And I believe it's really God's global apologetic in our global village, because these accounts are happening all over the
Right.
world. And I chronicle them all over the world. And yet they're experiencing the same reality in the afterlife and the same God.
Well, I'm curious when you kind of got serious about collecting the data or collecting the stories. So you encountered that book when your dad's in the hospital, you're extremely curious. When did you realize, oh man, I need to start keeping track of that? Because if you studied it like over 1,000, I just think of the 25, 30 interviews Randy Kay and I have done, just keeping track and managing that's a lot. How did you figure out a process to keep track of all those stories? That's a lot.
I mean, that is where I think it was a God thing. I really do, because I just, like I said, I gave my first talk on it in 1989. So that's when I began
Sure.
chronicling them. And then every time I would come across a new one, I would write it down, or, and I didn't know why. I was just curious. But, I realized when I finally, and I had asked the Lord after, I think it was after my second or third book I'd written, I was like, am I supposed to write a book about this? Like, why have I done this for 30 some odd years?
Just like your hobby.
It was, but it was kind of a secret a little bit,
Sure.
because it wasn't really very accepted in Christian circles.
Yeah,
And I knew that.
Culturally, that would have been forbidden back then.
No, many, many times. And honestly, unfortunately, the church not willing to really listen and wrestle with the integration of what these people are saying with the scriptures did a lot of damage. So a lot of people turned away from the church, though they didn't turn away from God. And so that created I think a schism for years, until Christians started becoming bold enough to say, no, this really happened to me, and that helped me start to integrate it. And it actually gave me some keys to understand how it does fit together.
And I want to get to some heaven stories in a moment, but in terms of the book Imagine Heaven, I think when that came out, you, Baker Publishing Group, nobody quite knew what was going to happen with that. And now you're kind of like the heaven guy. Like what was it like to figure out how to steward that? Because, like you said, you'd written other books before, but they didn't sell like Imagine Heaven did. Like this is just, I would describe it as kind of like a unicorn where all of a sudden it just goes, and it keeps going.
Well, I had a feeling the Lord wanted people to see that, this is something he's doing. It's a gift from God. Now, like every gift, people can abuse the gift, so just because what I often say is, I don't believe any one near-death experience. I don't take what they say, I take every one with a grain of salt. But what I found after studying thousands of them, and there are millions out there.
Right.
I mean, the Gallup poll found 1 out of 25 Americans have had a near-death experience where they've clinically died and come back, and had something to say about the afterlife. But I think when you look at what their commonalities across all of these are, and then you look at what the scripture says, well, that's right on. It's amazing. I mean, I chronicled about 40 descriptors that are pretty common to these near-death experiences, descriptors of the afterlife. And I actually compared it to the scriptures of all the world's religions. And in most of the scriptures of the world's religions, you might have 4 to 6 descriptors in their sacred scriptures of what to expect. But in the Bible, you have 40 out of the 40. And so it's amazing, honestly. And that's what I was trying to do, is show how these commonalities are actually what people are experiencing. And by the way, I think the Apostle Paul actually had a near-death experience.
I would agree.
Yeah. I mean, Acts chapter 14, he goes into Lystra. They turn on him, stone him to death. They knew how to kill people with stones back then.
Indeed.
They drug him out of the city and left him for dead. The believers rallied around him and prayed. He gets back up and goes back into the city. And then he says in 2 Corinthians 12, talking about himself, 14 years ago, whether in the body or out of the body, I'm not sure. Why did he say that? Well, because one of the commonalities is we're still ourselves. and we have a spiritual body. And we feel more real and alive than we ever have. In fact, not just with 5 senses, more like 50 senses, 100 senses. So Paul says he was taken up into heaven and saw and heard things inexpressible.
Well, along the journey, talking to people who've had these sorts of encounters, they're all amazing and fantastic in their own way. But there are those people that we meet, their stories that really mark us. I'm curious for you, of all the 1,000+ people you've chronicled their stories or captured their stories. Who are some of the people that really stood out to you? Or because like I could say like meeting Randy Kay was a major life shift for me. Now he's one of my dearest friends. Who are some of the people who've had these encounters along the way that have marked your journey?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to choose, honestly. But they're because different ones show different things
Right.
from different perspectives. So for me, being very analytical and an engineer, there are some like Pam Reynolds' story, um, where she when she died, it was to operate on a brain aneurysm. And they did this radical surgery because it was the only way they could get deep into her brain, where they have to lower her body temperature to 50 degrees, drain all her blood out of her brain. They put clickers in her ears at 100 decibels and taped her eyes shut so there was no stimuli. And they had to see a flat line on the EKG.
Right.
So no brain waves at all. And yet she leaves her body. She's up above in the room watching. And when she comes back, she's able to tell them not only who was in the room, which she came in with eyes taped shut, that one of the doctors, who was a female, couldn't get the vein in one of her legs, and the other doctor said, try the other leg. She described the saw to cut her head open that didn't look anything like you would think an electric saw. She said it looked more like an electric toothbrush with a socket set, like her dad's, socket set. She described everything perfectly, and the doctors were blown away that she could. So how could she possibly, if this isn't real? And there are many corroborative stories like that, where they witness things that they couldn't otherwise have known, observations they couldn't have made. And there have been scientific studies done showing how amazingly accurate these observations of NDEs are, who claim to have observed their resuscitation. So that's one category.
Sure.
The most amazing to me are blind people. So I chronicle 3 blind people's stories in Imagine Heaven. There are about 120 different people woven in. But one of the blind people was Vicky, who died in a car accident when she was 22. She was then in the hospital, leaves her body, and she's up above and she can see. And blind people will, and these are people who've never seen. So they say they don't have any mental images, no visual images at all. They don't dream in visual terms like we do. And yet she realized this new experience was sight, and she was able to identify, that's me down there. I must be dead. And then she takes off, and this is another commonality, and she goes literally up through the roof of the hospital.
Right.
She's able to see the surroundings, identify later the surroundings. And then another commonality is they enter a tunnel, or it's not always the same. Sometimes it's a pathway. Sometimes they're just there, but they travel to a place of amazing beauty. So Vicky finds herself in this garden-like setting that, grass, trees, birds, flowers, and lots of people. And she said, and light was coming out of everything. Light was coming out of the trees, out of the birds, out of the flowers, even out of the people. And she said, and these are commonalities. And the light was not just like you feel from the sun. It was like love and like life. They also say that. Now, here's an amazing thing. Blind people consistently say that in heaven, when they could see, the light comes out of everything.
Right.
Where would they ever have heard that on earth? Right? And they've never seen. And yet it correlates to what Isaiah 60 and Revelation 21 says, that in heaven there's no sun or moon. The glory of God is the light, and the Lamb, Jesus, is the lamp, and the nations will walk in that light. And that's exactly what these NDEs say. The light comes out of everything, and that light is life because it's the glory of God. So it's not like the sun. It's life and light and love. And so Vicky then sees this. Oh, another interesting thing is sometimes I think when people hear these near-death experiences and they hear people say these people were like people of light, or light was coming out of them, it sounds like, oh, that's new agey, or that's weird. That's not the Bible. Well, actually it is. In Daniel chapter 12, I believe, the angel tells Daniel at the resurrection, many will raise, some to everlasting shame, others to everlasting life. And those who are righteous will shine like the stars forever. Jesus in Matthew 13 says, then they will shine like the sun in my Father's kingdom. So this is all there, right? And so Vicky sees this. And then she sees her two childhood friends, Debbie and Diane. She grew up in a home for kids that were blind. And she sees them coming to her and she recognizes them. But she said they were in their prime. They had died when they were 9 and 11, but they were in their prime. So seems like people are commonly like in their late 20s.
Right.
And she recognized them, and they were healthy and whole. And then she sees this brilliant light to her right, looks, and brighter than anybody, more brilliant than the sun, there's another commonality, is God. And she knows this is Jesus. And she was a believer in Jesus. And Jesus hugs her. He says, welcome. You'll find everything fits together here. And he hugs her. And she said it was not like a hug on earth. It was like he went into me and I went into him. It was this intimacy.
Right.
And she felt so loved. And she said things like, when I looked into his eyes, it was like he looked right through me, like he knew everything about me, but that wasn't shameful. I wanted him to see everything because he loved me so unconditionally. And she notices light. She notices light coming out of his beard. She says things like that. And, light like a mound of diamonds sparkling and just, and then Jesus gives her a life review. And this is another commonality of near-death experiences. And so she relives her life up to that time. And it's kind of like a panoramic, watching your life in 3D replay. But the difference is, just like, in 2 Peter 3, it says to the Lord, 1,000 years is like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years. Well, they say the same thing. NDEs say time doesn't work the same way there.
Right.
Some say there's no time. Some say, well, there was time, but there was all the time you needed. So they relive their life, and she did. And what was fascinating is Jesus shows her interactions with Debbie and Diane in the home. So when she comes back to earth, she's able to attest to how Debbie and Diane moved. They had, they had problems walking, and she could describe that. She didn't know that when she was living with them because she was blind. And yet now she could attest to how they were because she had seen them in her life review. So Jesus finally sends her back. And, like he often does, he said, you still have more to do for me because we all have a purpose here. But that was, the blind ones, and there are other blind ones like that, to me are some of the most fascinating.
Yeah, I think for me, as I've kind of immersed myself in this space this past year, the specific details, about their family staying in another room, or could read the serial number on the top of the light in the operating, just crazy stuff. And then that comes back and is verified later. I think for this interview, the place I'd like to land, and we might get into more of the story in part 2 that we're going to record here in a few moments, is Howard Storm. We've both interviewed Howard Storm, and really culturally, Howard was one of those very early near-death experience stories that got out. He was on Oprah. I mean, he's had a book that sold really well. But you shared with us, I think this was at dinner last night, that Howard was a critical pivot point for you in terms of moving forward with writing the book. So I'd love to hear how and why Howard's story impacted you so much.
Yeah, because as a Christian pastor, I've come to believe that the scriptures are revealed by God and trustworthy completely, and I have reasons for that because of history, outside of any of these near-death experiences. And so I think we should evaluate what near-death experiencers are saying in light of the scriptures. That's what I was trying to do in Imagine Heaven. And there were some confusing things to me because a lot of near-death experiencers, they might not even know God, care about God, love God, not know Jesus, and yet they come back saying, I left my body, I was there above in the room watching the resuscitation. I felt wonderful. I felt like Superman. I felt like I had, more peace than I've ever had. And, I saw, this welcoming committee, another commonality, who came and greeted me. And then they go back in their body. Okay. And so the conclusion in the early 80s and 90s among many researchers is, see, this is not the God of the Bible. Because there's no judgment, there's no condemnation, there's only love. In fact, they don't, everybody goes to heaven. There is no hell. So that was the conclusion. Now, when Howard and some others started coming forward, then it kind of shook things because it's like, oh, there all are hellish experiences. By the way, in 2019, the European Academy of Neurology did a study across 35 countries and found 10% claimed they had had a near-death experience. They also found close to 50% reported more hellish experiences. Right. So these are as common. Just were very underreported. Because, who wants to say,
people are hesitant,
I'm such a horrible person, I had a hellish experience. Right. But the reason Howard's was a linchpin. So you want me to recap Howard's story?
Please.
Yeah. So Howard Storm was a tenured college professor. So no reason to make up crazy stories like this, right? He's an atheist, and he's taking students on a tour of art museums in France when his lower duodenum ruptures, and it's usually an hour or two before you die. He goes to a hospital, but it's Saturday, so they can't get a surgeon. 8 or 9 hours later, he dies. And he thought it was just going to be black, lights out. Computer shuts down, there's nothing. And so initially, he breathed his last, and all of a sudden, he's standing up beside his bed feeling great. And he said the same thing. I felt like Superman. I felt wonderful. And, he said, all these senses and such peace. And then he couldn't get his wife to respond to him. And he saw this person in the bed he was just in, and he was just confused about it. And I've come to believe that because time and space, I believe these experiences are happening in a dimension beyond our 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. There are more dimensionalities. And so it's a little confusing to them at first, but real. In fact, more real. So Howard has this welcoming committee come and say, Howard, come with us. And so what I realized is if you paused and he went back into his body right then, he was resuscitated right then, it would have been like any other, oh, look, atheists go to heaven. It was great. It was wonderful. The afterlife is bliss for everybody. That's not actually how the story continued. And so this welcoming committee that was nice and kind, Howard, come with you. Oh, we know all about you. He thinks they're there for his surgery. Right. And they kind of make out that, yeah, we're going to help you, follow us. And he starts to follow them. But as he follows them, they lead him into outer darkness, just like Jesus talks about. Outer darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Well, he experienced that in that he started to realize they're deceiving him, and they turn on him and they begin to just devour him, literally. And he he ends up in, fighting back wasn't working. It was just making them, egging them on. It's just evil with nothing but evil intent. But he ends up crying out to God. He remembers a song from when someone took him as a little kid to Sunday school. Jesus loves me. And he couldn't even remember this, I know. But that came into his mind. And I think God also put into his heart, pray to God. And he was struggling with it. Even in this hellish place, he's struggling with it. And finally he cries out, Jesus, save me. And into this outer darkness comes this pinpoint of light, brighter and brighter until it's more brilliant than the sun, but not hard to look at. It's what they all say. And outreach arms that grab him, take him up, and Jesus rescues him out of that, gives him a life review, tells him a lot of things. He comes back and he leaves his tenured college professorship 2 years later to become a Christian pastor. And because of it, his atheist wife divorces him.
Right.
So he's literally a Paul-like story. So the key for me there was just because a near-death experience may start well, doesn't mean it ends well. And other people's welcoming committees, they said, like Dr. Mary Neal, who's a surgeon, a spine surgeon, said this welcoming committee was there for her in her near-death experience. And she knew they were there to love her and guide her. And she said, and protect her.
Right.
And I'd heard protect from many people. And I asked her, I said, protect you from what? And she said, I don't know. I just intuitively knew they were there to protect me. So I think we are journeying into a new world, and there is evil on the other side, and it's deceptive. And that's why you don't go there without God bringing you there. And so I think what Howard showed me is just because it starts well, that doesn't mean that's your eternal destiny. In fact, I'm not sure whether you have a hellish or a good heavenly near-death experience determines your eternal destiny at all. I think in some cases, this is like God, this brilliant God of light, reveals himself to a Christian murderer, Paul.
Right.
Right? And Paul still had a choice. So after he experiences the God of light, Jesus didn't preach the gospel to him. All he said is go to the city. And Jesus sent Ananias to preach the gospel to him. And then Paul still had to get baptized for the remission of his sins. So he still had a choice to make. I think that's true of NDEs. They still come back and they still have a will and a choice to make of whether they'll seek this God of light and love and follow Jesus or not.
Well, I can say from all the people I've talked to in the last year on this topic, people are marked sometimes with good and bad. I mean, Howard from the hellish side of his NDE certainly I feel like has some trauma or PTSD from that side of his journey. He's very hopeful about the latter part when he goes to heaven, but that first part really marked him in a deep way. Sadly, it's time for us to wrap this episode, but don't worry. We're going to do a part 2 with John and get into more testimonies and stories of people who've encountered both hell and heaven. We'll be talking about near-death experiences. So come back next week. The book is Imagine Heaven. The author is John Burke, and we'll talk to you again soon.